Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. A woman found dead, a portrait shrouded in mystery, and a web of secrets threatening to unravel everything. Join Sherlock Holmes as he uncovers a deadly conspiracy in the heart of London. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Puzzle of the Painted Portrait. The evening had drawn in over London, the faint glow of gas lamps casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. The chill of autumn had settled in, though it did little to dampen the excitement inside Ferguson's gallery. Holmes, as always, was the very picture of calm, his long, lean figure moving with precise, deliberate steps through the hushed, softly lit room. Watson, trailing a little behind, could not help but take in the small crowd milling around the gallery, each one drawn to the painted portrait of Lady Eleanor Hargrave that stood at the centre of the exhibition. Holmes turned his sharp gaze towards the painting. Lady Eleanor, in all her aristocratic grace, was immortalised on canvas, her gaze serene and dignified. The artist's brushstrokes captured a peaceful scene, an idyllic estate set against a sweeping countryside, and yet there was an unsettling stillness in the air that lingered beneath the surface of the vibrant colours. Holmes was not one to be taken in by mere appearances, however. "I must admit, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice quiet, as he turned to inspect the portrait more closely. "It is a remarkable likeness, but one cannot help but wonder whether the subject has left behind something more than just a painted image." Before Watson could inquire further, a piercing scream shattered the evening's calm. The guests jumped, startled, as the shriek echoed through the gallery, its source coming from somewhere beyond the small circle of spectators gathered near the painting. Holmes's gaze hardened, his stance growing more alert as he instinctively moved towards the source of the disturbance. Watson, though startled, followed closely behind. They arrived at the back of the gallery, where a small group of guests had gathered around a rather distressed Mr. Ferguson, the gallery owner. He was pale, trembling, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. I don't know what happened," he stammered, his voice quivering. "She was just sitting there, admiring the painting. And now—" His voice trailed off as his hand shook, pointing towards the chair where Lady Eleanor's lifeless form rested. Holmes approached the scene with his usual quiet demeanour. Lady Eleanor Hargrave sat in a chair, her features soft and untroubled, her elegant hands resting gently in her lap. The only indication that something was amiss was the faint hint of unnatural colour around her lips and the unblinking gaze in her eyes. For a moment, Watson thought she might simply have dozed off, but the longer he looked, the more impossible that seemed. Holmes knelt beside her, his gaze fixed intently on her face, noting the stillness in the air that seemed to emanate from her. With a careful touch, he lifted her wrist, checking for a pulse. The action was mechanical, practiced. There was none. "She's dead," Watson whispered, though it felt almost too absurd to believe. Holmes's brow furrowed, and he leaned closer to examine the subtle details of her posture and expression. "Quite. But we must not jump to conclusions just yet, Watson," he said, his voice low, the careful observance of his words weighing every syllable. Watson was still trying to process the unexpected turn of events when Holmes's eyes fell on something peculiar. A small, nearly imperceptible smudge on Lady Eleanor's neck caught his attention, just beneath the line of her collar. It wasn't a bruise, but something darker, a stain of some kind that had settled into the contours of her skin. "Look here," Holmes said, pointing with a steady finger, though his voice betrayed no hint of surprise. "Do you see that?" Watson leaned in closer, examining the spot, which appeared to be a dark, faintly glossy mark against the paleness of her skin. It was hardly noticeable at first, but Holmes's sharp eyes had already marked it. It didn't belong there, not as a part of the natural pallor of death. "What is it?" Watson asked, his tone cautious, though unease was already creeping into his voice. "It's not entirely clear yet," Holmes replied, his tone more of a riddle than an answer. "But there is something chemical about it, I think." something that doesn't belong. As he stood, the soft shuffle of footsteps echoed through the room, the gallery now emptying as the guests were dismissed by Ferguson, who appeared to have recovered slightly from his initial shock. But the tension was thick, like a storm cloud gathering overhead, and everyone knew something was terribly wrong. Ferguson cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I'll call for the constable," he said, his voice shaky but determined. Holmes nodded, still deep in thought, his eyes darting about the gallery. "Yes, do so, but not a word of this to anyone just yet. I suspect that whoever did this has carefully crafted the circumstances. We must leave no stone unturned." As Ferguson hurried off, Holmes motioned for Watson to follow him. "We'll need to examine her belongings, Watson. There may be something more to her life, and to her death, than meets the eye." The quiet hum of the gallery filled the space, and though the scene seemed to settle, Holmes's mind was already racing, calculating, piecing together a puzzle only he could see. A man of few words but many thoughts, Sherlock Holmes was already stepping into a role he knew well, that of the investigator, tasked with unravelling the intricacies of a puzzle that, on the surface, appeared as simple as a woman's untimely death. But beneath the calm of the gallery's walls, the truth waited, silent but threatening to reveal itself. The gallery was empty now, save for the lifeless form of Lady Eleanor and the stillness that permeated the air. Holmes, his eyes sharp as ever, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity. His fingers brushed over the surface of the nearby chairs, each detail of the surroundings filed away in his mind. Watson, for his part, seemed deeply troubled by the suddenness of the death, but his companion was already methodically organising the mystery in his mind. As Holmes turned towards the small crowd that had gathered earlier, he motioned for them to step closer. The tension in the room was palpable, each guest visibly shaken by the tragic turn of events. Ferguson, the gallery owner, stood in the corner, wringing his hands. He was pale, still rattled, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and the guests. Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice was calm, but it carried authority, demanding attention. "I need you all to remain here for a moment. I shall be conducting an inquiry into this unfortunate event." Watson, his brow furrowed in concern, stood beside Holmes, watching the guests as they took seats. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken questions, and the sense that something darker was unfolding beneath the surface. Holmes, for his part, appeared unaffected by the growing unease. Holmes first approached Ferguson, his sharp eyes scanning every flicker of emotion in the gallery owner's face. "Mr. Ferguson, I assume you were here when Lady Eleanor arrived. Can you recall any unusual behaviour or conversation leading up to her collapse?" Ferguson swallowed hard, attempting to steady his breath. "No, nothing out of the ordinary, Mr. Holmes. She seemed as composed as ever, perhaps a little quieter than usual, but nothing to suggest anything untoward." Holmes observed him closely, noting the shift in his demeanour, the slight tremor in his voice. There was something Ferguson was not saying, but Holmes did not press him for answers just yet. Instead, he turned to the others. A few of the guests had gathered near the far corner of the room, casting furtive glances toward the body. Holmes approached them, his piercing gaze moving between each individual. There was the older gentleman, Lord Blackwood, a distinguished art patron who had spent much of the evening engaged in conversation with the deceased. To his side, Miss Hatherley, a young woman with a troubled expression, had been talking animatedly with Lady Eleanor just moments before the discovery of her death. And then there was Victor Larson, the art critic, who, although silent, had an air of quiet suspicion about him. His thin lips pressed tightly together as he avoided direct eye contact with Holmes. Holmes addressed them in turn, his voice measured and deliberate. "I must ask each of you to recall your interactions with Lady Eleanor this evening. It is vital that I understand her behaviour and any conversations she may have had before her untimely death." Lord Blackwood was the first to speak, his voice steady, but with an undertone of nervousness. "Lady Eleanor and I spoke briefly about the portrait, of course. I complimented her on it, as I'm sure many of us did. She seemed more reserved than usual, but nothing seemed amiss. He glanced toward Miss Hatherley for confirmation. Miss Hatherley nodded, though her gaze was distracted. She did mention something about a recent decision, something weighing on her mind. She didn't go into detail, though. I assumed it was related to her family or the estate. Holmes listened intently, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his chin. And you, Mr. Larson? Did you have any direct dealings with Lady Eleanor this evening? Larson's face remained impassive, his eyes darting toward the exit before returning to Holmes. No, he replied curtly, his voice betraying none of the tension in the room. I am merely an observer of art, not its creator. I had no interactions with Lady Eleanor beyond an introduction. Holmes gave him a long look, as though weighing the truth in Larson's words. There was something about his composure that didn't sit right with Holmes, but he chose not to press further for the moment. Instead, he turned to Ferguson again. I shall need access to the deceased's personal effects, Mr. Ferguson. Any letters, diaries, or correspondence that may shed light on her recent concerns. Ferguson hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I shall fetch them immediately. While Ferguson departed, Holmes began to circle the room, taking note of every detail. He inspected the portrait again, his sharp eyes catching the faintest alteration in the frame's corner. The signature, previously obscured by shadows, seemed almost too perfect, an artist's name in a flowing script, though it looked suspiciously new. There was no immediate sign of tampering, yet Holmes suspected something was amiss. Holmes's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet murmur from the far side of the room. It was Ferguson, returning with a small leather case in hand. He opened it with a clink of metal, revealing a series of papers, including a letter and a ledger. Holmes took the items without a word, flipping through them with the grace of one used to the weight of evidence. The letter caught his attention. It was short, dated a few days prior, and it was signed in a hurried hand. The portrait will soon be finished. We must settle this matter before it is too late. I cannot live in the shadow of it any longer. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he handed the letter to Watson without a word. The room was still, save for the quiet rustle of paper. This, Holmes muttered, will need further inspection. Perhaps there is more here than we think. The hours passed slowly in the gallery, the muted hum of whispered voices barely disturbing the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Holmes had taken little time to dismiss the immediate findings. Lady Eleanor's death was no simple misfortune. The cryptic letter, along with Ferguson's nervous behaviour, had already begun to weave a tangled web of suspicion that neither he nor Watson could ignore. Yet, as Holmes studied the letter further, something gnawed at him, a sense of lingering doubt that the pieces of this puzzle were too neatly arranged. Watson, for his part, had grown increasingly restless. It was difficult to escape the sense of unease that clung to the gallery like a second skin. Ferguson had retreated into another room to attend to the arrangements, leaving Holmes and Watson alone to sift through the scant clues that had surfaced thus far. The gallery, once an elegant sanctuary of art, now seemed a mausoleum, the air thick with unanswered questions. Holmes, what do you make of it all? Watson asked, breaking the silence. He stood across from his friend, watching as Holmes meticulously examined the letter, turning it over in his hands, each crease and smear seeming to hold greater meaning. I'm not sure yet, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice deep with thought. The letter suggests something imminent, a decision, perhaps a desperate one. But there is something else, something hidden beneath the surface of these words. He placed the letter back on the table and stood, walking toward the portrait once again. His eyes, narrowed in concentration, traced the edges of the painting. There was a familiarity to the landscape that tugged at his mind, a strange sense that the place depicted in the background had been seen before, perhaps in one of the many cases Holmes had investigated. But he could not place it. Not yet, anyway. Lady Eleanor's estate, Holmes said aloud, though more to himself than to Watson. It was mentioned several times in the letters I've reviewed, and there were hints of financial difficulties. But why would she need to discuss it here, of all places? He turned abruptly, eyes meeting Watson's with an intensity that seemed to crackle in the air. There is someone else involved in all of this, Watson. Someone who has been keeping secrets, perhaps even using Lady Eleanor's vulnerability as leverage. Watson frowned, uneasy. And you believe Ferguson is the one? Holmes didn't answer immediately, instead turning his attention to the small stack of papers Ferguson had handed over. As he sifted through them, he paused at a ledger that seemed to hold little more than routine business transactions. But a quick glance at the last few pages, dated just before the portrait's completion, revealed something that caught Holmes's attention. An unusual deposit from a seemingly minor source, with a name attached that Holmes did not recognize. The amount was substantial for someone of little apparent means. That's odd, Holmes muttered, more to himself than to Watson. What is? Watson inquired, stepping closer. Holmes handed him the ledger, pointing to the entry. This transaction, dated 2 days before Lady Eleanor's death. The amount seems inconsistent with the rest of the business dealings listed here. It's almost as if someone was paying for something. Or someone. Watson's brow furrowed as he read over the entry. Do you think it's connected to the portrait? Holmes didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and began to pace, his mind turning over the details. The room, once full of guests admiring fine art, now seemed to close in on them. The walls, heavy with the weight of hidden truths, felt oppressive, as if they too had secrets buried beneath their pristine surfaces. Before Holmes could offer any further insight, the door to the gallery creaked open, and Ferguson reappeared, looking even more nervous than before. His eyes darted between Holmes and Watson, before settling uneasily on the floor. I trust you've found what you were looking for, Ferguson asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Holmes didn't miss the tremor in the man's voice. Not quite yet, Holmes replied, his gaze never leaving Ferguson's face. But we are not finished here. There are questions that need answering. I hope you understand that, Mr. Ferguson. Ferguson swallowed, his throat working as he seemed to struggle for control. I can explain everything. There's nothing untoward, I assure you. Holmes didn't respond immediately, but instead reached down to pick up a small envelope that had been tucked away in the papers Ferguson had handed over earlier. It was sealed with a wax stamp, unusual in its simplicity. A single letter H was etched into the wax, but the design was crude, almost as though it had been done in haste. Perhaps you can explain this then, Holmes asked, holding up the envelope between his fingers. Ferguson's face went pale, and he took a half-step backward, as though the very sight of the envelope had struck him with some unseen force. I don't know what you're implying, he stammered, though his voice faltered. Holmes's gaze never wavered. I believe you do, Mr. Ferguson. And I believe this letter, though unopened, will offer us the key to understanding what has transpired here. For a long moment there was silence. The tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. Watson's heart beat faster as he watched the gallery owner's reaction, sensing that whatever lay within that letter was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Ferguson took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak. It's not what you think, Mr. Holmes, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want any of this, but... A sudden sound broke through the conversation. A muffled voice from behind the door, hurried footsteps approaching. Ferguson's eyes widened in alarm. Do not open that letter, he hissed, his eyes frantic. But it was too late. Holmes had already torn the wax seal, his hands moving with practiced precision, and he began to unfold the letter. The words inside were brief, the ink slightly smudged from age, but unmistakable in their intent. The quiet of the gallery hung thick, almost suffocating in its intensity, as Holmes read the letter aloud in a voice that was steady, but laced with tension. The words were simple, written in a hand that, while practiced, carried a sense of haste and desperation. The matter will be settled soon. You know what must be done to secure it. The portrait must remain intact. Only then will the inheritance be ours. Do not let her die in vain. Holmes paused, his finger tracing the words as he let their meaning sink in. The room was still, save for the slight rustle of paper as Watson shifted uneasily beside him. There was no mistaking it now. Lady Eleanor's death was no accident, and her death, as the letter suggested, had been planned with ruthless precision. Ferguson stood frozen, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him. The shift in his demeanour had not gone unnoticed by Holmes, whose eyes narrowed as he assessed the gallery owner. "You knew," Holmes said, his voice low but firm. "You knew what was happening, Mr. Ferguson, and yet you allowed this to unfold." Ferguson's lips trembled as he struggled for words, his breath shallow. "No, you misunderstand," he began, his voice tight with anxiety. "I had no part in her death, I swear it. But the inheritance, it was tied to the portrait, Holmes. She was the key to everything. I was only trying to keep things in line, but this was not what I intended." Holmes did not respond immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on Ferguson, as if searching for any hint of deceit. His mind was already at work, piecing together the puzzle that was quickly coming into focus. Watson, who had been observing the exchange in silence, stepped forward. "What inheritance? What do you mean by that, Ferguson?" His voice was steady, though there was a sharp edge to his words, the quiet anger of someone who had seen too much deceit and too many lies. Ferguson's eyes flickered nervously, as though the walls of the gallery itself were closing in on him. It was Eleanor's late husband, Lord Hargrave. His fortune was meant to go to her, but only if certain conditions were met. And the portrait, it was part of those conditions. There was a clause in the will, a clause she didn't even know about, not fully. Holmes stepped closer, his presence commanding the room. "A clause, you say? And how exactly did you come to know about this clause, Mr. Ferguson?" Ferguson's eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet Holmes's gaze. He shifted uneasily, his hands trembling. I was the executor of Lord Hargrave's will," he admitted in a hushed tone. "And there were certain conditions that had to be fulfilled for the inheritance to pass to Eleanor. The portrait, her likeness, painted just as it was one of those conditions. She had to display it proudly before a select group of people. It had to be seen as a tribute to her late husband. Only then would she inherit everything." Holmes's mind raced. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The portrait was not just a painting, it was a symbol, a key to something far larger than the gallery and its art collection. Lady Eleanor had been caught in a scheme that involved far more than her own vanity or familial duties. This was about money, power, and the lengths people would go to secure them. "And the smudge on her neck?" Watson interjected, his voice betraying his growing confusion. "What does that have to do with the portrait and the inheritance?" Holmes turned, his eyes sharp with understanding. "A well-placed poison, Watson," he said, the words falling from his lips with a chilling clarity. "A poison that would induce paralysis, a subtle form of death. It's clear that Lady Eleanor didn't simply die in her sleep. She was killed, and the method was chosen to avoid suspicion. Ferguson may not have administered the poison himself, but he knew what was happening." Ferguson for the first time seemed to snap. He raised his hands, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I didn't kill her. I swear to you I didn't. But I knew who would. I knew someone who had been following her for months. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not like this." His voice trailed off, breaking under the weight of his confession. Holmes stepped back, his eyes calculating, processing the new information. "Who, Ferguson? Who is this person you are speaking of?" The gallery owner hesitated, as if weighing the decision between protecting his own neck and revealing the truth. The tension in the room stretched taut, and for a moment it seemed as though the silence would break. Finally, Ferguson's voice trembled as he spoke, his words barely above a whisper. "Victor Larson." At the mention of the name, Watson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Larson, the art critic, had seemed nothing more than an innocent observer of the evening's events, an aloof figure in the background. But now, Holmes's sharp mind began to put the pieces together, and the puzzle began to shift in a new direction. Holmes turned back to Ferguson, his gaze unflinching. "You're telling me that Larson was behind all of this? That he had some hand in Lady Eleanor's death?" Ferguson nodded frantically, his breath quickening. Yes. He was the one who arranged it all. He was supposed to make sure the portrait remained in place, make sure the inheritance was secured. But I didn't know he would go that far. I thought it would just be a matter of pressure, manipulation. I never thought he would kill her. Holmes stood still for a moment, considering the confession. "Then Larson is our true culprit," he said, his voice almost too calm in contrast to the turmoil of emotions around him. "But why, Ferguson? Why would Larson need to kill Lady Eleanor?" Ferguson shuddered, his hands pressed against his chest as if trying to steady himself. "Because he wanted the fortune. He didn't want Eleanor to inherit everything. He thought he could manipulate her into giving up her claim. And he was right. She was vulnerable. But when she started to fight back, to resist, he decided it would be easier to take everything by force." Holmes's lips tightened into a grim line as the final pieces fell into place. The mystery was far from solved, but the first steps were clear. Ferguson had been an unwilling participant, a pawn in a larger scheme orchestrated by Larson, a man driven by greed and a desire for control. The next step was clear. Larson had to be found. The quiet resolve that had marked Holmes's demeanour throughout the investigation began to shift, replaced by an urgency that settled into the very air around them. Ferguson's confession had turned the case on its head, unveiling a truth both chilling and unexpected. Larson, the art critic, was no innocent bystander in this crime. He was the orchestrator of Lady Eleanor's death, a puppet master pulling the strings of those too desperate or too fearful to resist. But the discovery came with its own dangers, and Holmes knew that the clock was now ticking. "We must find Larson, Watson," Holmes said, his voice calm but edged with the gravity of the moment. "If he's as involved as Ferguson suggests, he will not stop at one murder. He will attempt to cover his tracks, and he will do so without hesitation." Watson, his pulse quickening as the magnitude of the situation sank in, nodded in agreement. "And we have no idea where he's gone, do we?" Holmes's eyes narrowed as he moved toward the window, peering out at the darkening London streets. The evening had already settled into a misty twilight, the fog rolling in from the Thames, thickening the atmosphere and adding an unsettling sense of isolation to the already charged moment. "I have an idea," Holmes murmured, his voice steady, though the tension in his posture suggested that he knew they were running out of time. "Larson may have anticipated our next move. He will not leave such an obvious trail. No, we need to think like him. Think like a man who believes he is untouchable." A sudden noise broke the quiet. The sound of hurried footsteps approaching from the hallway, accompanied by voices murmuring in agitation. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, the sharp shift in the room's energy palpable. It was too soon for the constables to arrive. Something else was afoot. Before either of them could react, the door to the gallery burst open. In the doorway stood a figure, half obscured by the heavy fog that rolled in from outside. It was Larson, his silhouette barely visible through the haze, but unmistakable. His usual composure had been replaced by an almost manic energy, his eyes wide with a combination of fear and determination. Holmes stood still for a moment, his body taut with the sudden change in atmosphere. Watson instinctively moved to his side, his hand hovering near his coat pocket where he kept his revolver. The last thing they needed was an unexpected confrontation, especially with a man as dangerous as Larson. Well, Holmes said, his voice steady, though there was a sharp edge to his words. "It seems our prey has come to us. I trust you have come to explain yourself, Mr. Larson." Larson's lips curled into a tight, almost mocking smile, but it did little to mask the terror in his eyes. "I did not expect you to be so quick, Holmes," he said, his voice strained, though there was an undeniable arrogance beneath his words. "But I suppose I should have known better. You always get your man." Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he studied Larson with the keenest of eyes, watching every small twitch of his muscles, every shift in his posture. It was a game for Larson now, one that he had no intention of losing, even if it meant going to extremes. "Tell me, Mr. Larson," Holmes continued, his voice soft but dangerous. "Did you truly think you could get away with it? That Lady Eleanor's death would simply vanish into the fog, unnoticed by the likes of us?" Larson took a step into the room, his eyes scanning the gallery, as though looking for an escape. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, the tension in his frame unmistakable. "She was a means to an end, Holmes," he said, his voice lowering. "And if she hadn't been so obstinate, she would have been just another part of the plan. You wouldn't understand. People like you." He spat the words as if they were poison. "You don't understand the lengths we must go to when there is something worth more than a mere life." Holmes's jaw tightened slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on Larson. He had heard it all before, the cold, calculated justifications of criminals who believed they were above the law. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, there was something personal about Larson's demeanor, something that suggested the man had already resigned himself to his fate. "And what is it that you truly seek, Mr. Larson?" Holmes asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and disdain. "What is so precious that it justifies murder, money, power, a legacy? You, who are nothing more than a critic of art, now standing as the mastermind behind a killing." Larson's expression flickered, and for a brief moment, Holmes saw something akin to pain flash across his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold resolve. "I sought the inheritance," Larson said, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. "The fortune that was promised to her. I couldn't let her keep it, not when she had the power to stop everything. I would have done anything to have it, and if that meant taking her life, then so be it." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And you think you can simply walk away from this, Larson? That you can flee to some hidden corner of the world and disappear into obscurity?" Larson's lips twisted into a cruel smile, though his eyes darted around the room with increasing desperation. He had not accounted for the resolve in Holmes's gaze, the relentless certainty that he would see justice done. "You don't understand," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "I had no choice. No choice at all." In a flash, Larson's hand shot out, grabbing a nearby sculpture from the table and hurling it toward Holmes with a sudden, violent movement. The room erupted in chaos, the sound of the object smashing against the wall filling the space as Holmes darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the impact. Watson was quick to react, moving swiftly toward Larson with a shout. "You won't escape," he called, his voice a command rather than a plea. The tension that had built throughout the evening now reached its peak. The gallery, once an artful haven, had become the setting for a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The confrontation in the gallery was brief, a whirlwind of movement and violence that left the air thick with the taste of salt and dust. As the sculpture shattered against the far wall, Holmes's instincts had kicked in, and the momentary chaos of the room had settled into a tense yet calculated calm. Watson had been the first to act, diving forward to intercept Larson, grabbing him by the arm with a force that belied the urgency of the situation. Larson, however, had been quick, too quick for Watson to fully restrain him. For a moment, it seemed as though they were caught in a deadly dance, Larson twisting and pulling away, desperate for escape, while Holmes remained an observer, patient and unshaken. "You have nowhere to run, Larson," Holmes said, his voice low but unwavering, a calm anchor in the midst of the storm. "You can't escape what you've done." Larson's eyes darted around the room, his chest heaving as he took in the stark reality of his situation. His hands trembled, his breath came in short, ragged gasps, and despite the fire in his eyes, there was an unmistakable resignation in his posture. The frantic energy that had once fueled him seemed to ebb away, replaced by a cold, harsh truth. He was cornered. You think you know everything, don't you? Larson spat, his voice dripping with venom. But you don't know what it's like, to be on the edge, with nothing left to lose. He shook his head, his voice faltering. Eleanor had to die. I had no choice. I thought I could manipulate her, control her, but she was too strong. She didn't understand what was at stake. Holmes's gaze remained steady, his focus never wavering from Larson's wild eyes. No, Mr. Larson, he replied, his words measured and final. You are mistaken. It is not Lady Eleanor who did not understand. It is you who did not understand the consequences of your actions. You thought yourself clever, thinking you could profit from her misfortune. But in the end, it was your own arrogance that brought you to this point. Larson recoiled as if the words themselves struck him. The defiance that had once held him upright seemed to crumble in the face of Holmes's calm resolve. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. I was only trying to survive, Larson murmured, almost to himself. I thought if I had the fortune, everything would change. I never thought it would come to this. Watson tightened his grip on Larson's arm, pulling him forward with an urgency that made the air hum with the promise of justice. Survival, you say? You're not the only one who's ever faced hard choices, Larson. But murder, no matter how you spin it, you're responsible for this. Holmes nodded in agreement, but his gaze softened slightly, as though understanding the twisted nature of Larson's reasoning. You wanted power, control, and wealth. But now you are left with none of those things. You have only your guilt to bear. A tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of Larson's words and the finality of the situation. It was clear to Holmes that the man had not acted out of some grand malice. He had acted out of desperation, believing himself to be in a corner. But that did not absolve him of the crime. As the constables arrived moments later, summoned by Holmes in the midst of the confrontation, Watson turned his attention to the final piece of the puzzle, the gallery itself. Despite the chaos, the walls remained untouched by the violence, and the portrait of Lady Eleanor, the object at the heart of it all, stood silently in the background. The colours of the painting, once vibrant, now seemed almost mournful, as if it too understood the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. Holmes, in his usual manner, surveyed the room once more, allowing his sharp eyes to take in every detail. His thoughts, though focused on Larson's fate, lingered briefly on the significance of the portrait. He had learned much in the course of the investigation, about power, greed, and the manipulation of those who were vulnerable. But there was something else that lingered in his mind as well. Turning to Watson, Holmes spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both resolution and a touch of weariness. The portrait was not just a means to an end, Watson. It was the reflection of a life that was never meant to be altered. Lady Eleanor's death, tragic as it was the result of forces beyond her control. But perhaps, in the end, the portrait will continue to speak for her, even in her absence. Watson, ever the pragmatist, nodded slowly. It's strange, isn't it? He said. How something so beautiful could have been used for something so dark. Holmes offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. Indeed, Watson, it often is. But in the end, the truth is always revealed, whether we are ready for it or not. As the constables began to take Larson into custody, Holmes turned to leave, the quiet of the gallery settling back into place. The mystery had been solved, but the toll of it all lingered in the air. Holmes's mind, though satisfied with the resolution, could not escape the haunting feeling that, in a world governed by greed and ambition, no one could truly be free from the consequences of their actions. Watson fell in step beside him, the evening air cool against his skin. The fog that had enveloped the city earlier seemed to have lifted, revealing the dim glow of streetlights ahead. So, Holmes, Watson said, his voice a touch softer now, as they walked away from the gallery. What will happen to the painting? Holmes paused, his gaze fixed ahead. It will remain there, Watson, as it should. A reminder of the complexities of the human condition and the lengths to which some will go to claim what they believe is their due. But the portrait itself will endure. Watson glanced back at the gallery one last time, his thoughts lingering on Lady Eleanor, whose image would forever be linked with the mystery that had unfolded in that very room. In silence they walked on, the case behind them, but its echoes resonating through the foggy streets of London, where shadows of the past never quite fade.